The governor asked some deputies and officers from around the state to come up to Portland and help with the protests. Their answer? A big, fat no. Well, so much for that plan. Hey, remember that big health epidemic this year? No, before COVID. I know it seems like forever ago, but we're going to check in on what's going on with vaping. That's still a thing, right? And we're going back inside Woodlawn. I mean, way back, like 2 decades ago, for a look at what school was like then. Here's the story.
Love the Vault. Hey, thanks for being with us tonight. Lots to talk about. If you have something to say, use that hashtag HeyDan on social media. I'm Dan Haggerty. Welcome to the story. Let's get right to it. And we're going to start with our big story tonight, and it's all about the response from law enforcement to the protests, or maybe the lack thereof. So we've got Portland police fighting with protesters almost every night, a district attorney who won't charge people for lesser offenses like interfering with an officer or ignoring those calls to clear the streets. We have a governor calling on state police to come help, and deputies from around Oregon refusing that call to help, citing policies like the ones I just mentioned from the DA. But wait. There's more. Within the last 60 minutes, another development that could allow officers to bypass the DA entirely when it comes to charges and up the ante for protesters when the violence starts. Lots to unpack here. Pat Doris joining me live. He's been all over this today. Let's start with that last bit, Pat, and that new development. What do you know?
Well, Dan, I think this is huge. This is basically the ground changing under the feet of the protesters, because when the state police come in and they are cross-deputized by the U.S. Marshal's Office, suddenly they're able to make arrests under the federal laws. And I'm told that there is something similar to interfering with a police officer under the federal law. The county district attorney will not prosecute someone for that charge, but the U.S. Attorney's Office has been much more aggressive at holding people accountable and in prosecuting for all kinds of charges. And so I think you're going to see a lot more of that start to happen as soon as these officers arrive. Dan?
I'm getting a lot of a different vibe from the governor's plan. Yesterday, it seemed like a more passive approach. In fact, we discussed how the last time federal officers or officers with federal power came in, things didn't go that great. The violence grew, the crowds grew, the protests grew, and it seemed as though that wasn't going to be what we saw this time based on the governor's approach. But now I'm hearing this. How have things changed in your opinion there?
Well, a couple of things. So first, the state officers who came in to protect the U.S. federal courthouse and get the federal agents out of there, I'm thinking they were likely cross-deputized then, and maybe it's the same group of folks. So that's thing one. Thing two is a much more aggressive thing, you're right, with them coming now out. I think that the public is going to take it differently, because instead of having this perception that President Trump is sending in a whole cadre of federal agents that are going to take over the city and teach those Democrats how to do things right, instead, these are the people that have grown up here, that are state police officers all over the state. People know them. People generally have a very high respect for the state police, but they're also going to have these federal powers. They're not just going to stay at the federal courthouse, by the way. They'll probably be all over the city wherever the protests are. And those are two big distinctions, I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and that's another big point. The fact that those federal officers before were around federal buildings, but these officers are state police who are able to travel throughout the city and still have that same jurisdictional power. Have you heard, with this big development, anything from the people who we have been discussing here, the district attorney, people with the police union, any of the sheriffs who were saying they weren't going to come up and help because of some of the policies that were in place that they felt put officers at risk?
Well, in the last hour, I've been emailing and tweeting to everybody that I can think of. And from the district attorney's office, I think this is new information for them as well. So they're basically saying we have no comment at this point. I did try to contact one of the sheriffs that I had talked to earlier today, and I've not heard back. I did also reach out to the union president for the police here in town. He had not heard about that, so he wanted to learn a little more before he commented. But, you know, you referred about the governor. I did a Zoom interview one-on-one with the governor yesterday afternoon, and she talked about her plan, and I was kind of pressing her on, isn't it time for the National Guard? Come on. But she was pretty comfortable and pretty casual, I thought. And so either something changed, and maybe she expected that the sheriffs would say no, because she said, if this plan doesn't work, we'll just go to the next plan. But clearly something has ratcheted up significantly. So again, These officers coming in may have already been federally deputized, but their mission is going to be much, much different than when they were just standing behind a fence in one place. Dan?
Very interesting, Pat. Thank you. And we'll look forward to hearing from some of our local leaders as well. And as Pat mentioned, he did speak to the governor about the National Guard. We're going to talk about that in just a moment as well. Pat, thank you so much. We want to focus, though, for just a minute on Portland police. They again declared a riot last night. They made arrests like the one you're seeing here, the officer running to, then tackling and punching that person down on the ground there. Portland police tell us they're reviewing this video and the use of force that you saw there to determine if it meets their standards. Again, that video was from a few hours ago. It was from last night, but it's nearly indistinguishable from most nights, I think, over the past 3 months. I talked to a criminal law professor from Oregon State University who has studied these protests and many just like them. And we talked a lot about the police response and some of the tactics that they use. You can find the first part of our interview on the KGW YouTube channel right now. But tonight, I want to show you the part of our discussion over how police manage dueling protests, like the ones we have seen over the past few weekends.
There is a lot of debate and concern right now about the treatment that police give to various ideological sides here, whether they be a right-wing identified group such as the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer, and then people who identify on the left, which right now categorically have been people who would be described as Antifa or somebody involved in any Black Lives Matter movement. How do you look at the differences in the ways that police handled the skirmish and the fighting between those two different sides that happened over the weekend, last weekend, and the way that they're deploying their tactics on a more traditional protest turned riot that we've been seeing on a nightly basis?
So to avoid another Charlottesville, it's absolutely essential that police know ahead of time that these things are going to happen. And look, they're right on Facebook, they're right on social media. So it's not that difficult of an intelligence job for police to anticipate when these things are going to happen. One of the excuses I saw for police not intervening was that they didn't have enough officers for one of the events. I mean, that's just inexcusable. It's not appropriate. You know these events are going to take place. You make sure you have enough officers there, and you have to separate the two sides. You cannot, I mean, I saw some talk about there being sort of, mutually agreeable combat. That's just inappropriate in American streets today to allow mutual combat. We have to separate the two sides. We know it's going to turn violent. There's no excuse for not having a sufficient number of officers there and separating the two groups and not favoring either one. The First Amendment, requires us as a nation to not exert enforcement activity, based on the content of the speech or the content of the protest. All sides need to be viewed as equal by police under our First Amendment. So you just need to keep the groups separated and ensure that they don't come into conflict with one another. Otherwise, we're going to end up with some deaths and really serious injuries on our hands.
Of course, at this point, we know that we have seen a death on our hands. Again, that was Ed McGuire, professor with Arizona State University. I may have misspoke earlier and said Oregon State. He's with Arizona State. Thank you for his time. Now, a lot of people have been asking about bringing in a different type of police force, the National Guard. Terry wrote me on Facebook. You heard Pat talk about this a second ago. Terry said Governor Brown should be calling in the National Guard. That's her only option. And as Pat said, he spoke with the governor about this yesterday. Here's a little bit of their conversation.
It does seem that if you could bring 2,000 men and women into Portland to protect the public buildings, that would tip the scales, wouldn't it?
I think that's a really good question, and I think people are asking that. But if these folks are not trained in crowd control and not trained in law enforcement, then you're not putting the right seats in the right location. You're not putting the right personnel to do the right job. And that's what we need now.
So we should know, way back in June when this all first started, the governor did call in 50 Oregon National Guard members, but they were just there to support PPB behind the scenes, meaning they weren't really on the front lines making arrests or doing crowd control or things like that. Now, we know so many of you have questions about what's happening downtown every night. Trust me, we do too. You know that. We've got a lot of people working to try and provide some clarity and context. So if you have a question, let us know. Use that hashtag HeyDan on Twitter, email the story at kgw.com, or find me on Facebook at Dan Haggerty KGW. Now, I want to take a minute and remember the original intent of these demonstrations, right? To rally for racial justice, something black people in Oregon have been fighting for a very long time. Robert sent me this on Twitter last night. He said, "Hey Dan, in the light of the Black Lives Matter protest, did you know that the racist language in the Oregon Constitution wasn't removed until 2002? Evidently, 30% of the population voted to retain it. Black people only got this victory 18 years ago. Is there anything in the KGW vault about this?" Well, we have talked about this before on this story, but it is worth repeating since most of you don't usually watch us every single day like you should. Before it became a state, the government of the Oregon Territory passed what were called black exclusion laws. Black people essentially were not allowed to settle in this territory or own any property. Those laws became part of the Constitution when Oregon first became a state in 1859. Voters eventually did repeal those laws in 1926, but like Robert said, the actual language was not removed from the state constitution until 2002, and 30% of voters at the time wanted to keep that racist language in. In the early 1900s, the Ku Klux Klan was booming in Oregon. Oregon actually had the largest KKK membership per capita in the entire country, and they helped get racist politicians elected to office, including Governor Walter M. Pierce in 1922. And like a lot of cities across the country, Portland was no stranger to redlining. Banks denied mortgages to people of color in certain areas, created segregated neighborhoods. The map you see here of Portland shows how it was divided up in 1940. The red areas are labeled hazardous because of, quote, undesirable populations. The federal government banned the practice in the 1970s after the civil rights movement, but the effects of it are still doing resounding harm to this day.
You might have seen some stats floating around the internet about the number of people who died from COVID with other health conditions. Well, as usual, it's not so simple, so we'll break it down for you. And if you're not already stressed out enough, we're here to remind you that a huge tsunami could hit the coast at any time. When the story continues.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I know you probably got your phone in your hand. If you do, hop on Instagram. Give us a follow at The Story KGW, a really great way to connect with us. And speaking of social media, maybe you've seen this claim about COVID deaths that's been circulating. A ton of people have been sharing it, including the president. It says, quote, "This week, the CDC quietly updated the COVID number to admit that only 6% of all the deaths recorded actually died from COVID, claiming that it's only about 9,000 deaths total that were actually from COVID-19. Is this true? KGW investigative reporter Kristen Severance looked into this claim for us. Kristen, I've been seeing this everywhere, honestly.
Everywhere. I've seen it on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. People are really trying to use this as a way to say, see, COVID is not that serious. But if you really look at the facts and the numbers, that's just not true. So let's start with the claim that the CDC released this information quietly in a new report. Well, if you look on the CDC website, it says, quote, "For 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned." So that's true, but this is not new, and the agency did not release it quietly. Internet archives show the CDC has been publishing this data for months. Here it is on May 9th, same wording, same report nearly 4 months ago. So the claim that this is new information is false. All right, next is the claim that a small fraction of the 180,000 deaths were truly from COVID-19. KGW medical expert Dr. Pyle Coley said that again is just not true.
The fact is, the CDC did share on their website that 6% of those deaths are due only to COVID-19. In other words, that was the only diagnosis put on the death certificate. But 94%, the remainder of those COVID-19 deaths, had COVID-19 on the death certificate, but they may also have had potentially other diagnoses, such as the patient's underlying medical problems, their diabetes, their heart failure, their COPD, or what have you. So COVID by itself as a direct cause of death is a rare finding because the way that COVID leads you to die is by causing organ complications. So for example, if COVID causes a stroke or causes your kidneys to shut down or causes respiratory failure, all of those diagnoses will also go on the death certificate as causes of death. So it's unusual to just have COVID-19 as a cause of death, and that's the reason that that number is so small. This doesn't mean that COVID is taking very few people's lives. It's just an administrative phenomena.
So it sounds like, at least according to Dr. Coley, that COVID should rarely, if ever, be the only cause of death listed on a death certificate.
Right. She said coronavirus is similar to HIV/AIDS. So you don't die from that, you die from something else. She explains further.
And an HIV analogy that you bring up is an excellent one, because HIV doesn't kill you. HIV suppresses your immune system so that you catch other infections that kill you. And similarly with this virus, COVID-19 causes inflammation in your organs and organ failure. That then leads to your demise. So listing just COVID-19 is a little sloppy, in my opinion, when writing a death certificate.
Bottom line here, Dan, numbers are very important. Data is so important. We say that all the time, but without context, you can see how people are trying to use this information to really fit their narrative.
Got it. Kristen Severance, thank you so much for the clarifying report.
You're welcome.
All right, let's talk about the times before COVID. I know it feels like forever ago, but at the end of last year, we were all talking about vaping. You remember all the vaping-related illnesses and deaths. We did stories almost every day here on The Story, but COVID has obviously taken our attention from that. So now I'm wondering what really is going on with vaping at this point. Well, actually not too much. Last August and September, a lot of people were being hospitalized for lung injuries related to vaping, and 2 people died in Oregon. But you can see here on this graph that hospitalizations went way down in January and February, and that might be because they figured out what was likely to blame, that vitamin E acetate in vape products, especially ones containing THC. Some states, including Washington, banned products with that additive. Oregon had a temporary ban on flavored vaping products when this epidemic was going on. And state lawmakers tried to make that law permanent, but they never could get it passed. But now there is some more recent vaping news. Stanford released a study earlier this month that was linking vaping to higher risks of COVID-19 in teens and young adults. And it's not just a small risk, but a big one, according to this report. They found that people who used either regular e-cigarettes or cigarettes were almost 5 times more likely to experience COVID-19 symptoms. So another thing to just keep in mind if you vape. All right, I know this is the last thing that you want to talk about right now. It's the last thing I want to talk about. But the fact is, we live on a massive subduction zone, which means a devastating earthquake and tsunami could hit at any moment. Kaylee Chalmers has a look at some new simulations showing the impact on Washington's southwest coast.
In 2011, a tsunami generated by subduction zone earthquake struck the coast of Japan, inundating entire communities. It's a scenario geologists have said time and time again will someday play out along the Washington and Oregon coasts as well, when the Cascadia subduction zone off our shore ruptures, generating a magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami.
In the Pacific Northwest, we have one of the highest earthquake and tsunami hazards in all of the nation.
Karina Allen is the chief hazards geologist for the Washington Geological Survey.
The last major Cascadia subduction zone earthquake happened 320 years ago. And these big earthquakes happen on average every 200 to 600 years. So we're well within the time period that we could have another one of these big earthquakes.
The agency just released new computer simulations showing what the massive waves would do to the southwest Washington coast. Like, for example, the Long Beach Peninsula. About 15 to 20 minutes after the earthquake, the first wave hits Long Beach. Minutes later, almost the entire peninsula is underwater, and the waves keep coming.
And then it reaches the port of Ilwaco in about 30 minutes and travels all the way up the Columbia River.
Geologists with the state of Oregon have generated similar simulations. This one shows what would happen to Seaside. Again, within minutes, the community would be inundated. Geologists say the waves would also move up the Columbia River, but nothing more than a strong current would make it all the way to Portland.
The modeling work that we did demonstrated that the tsunami really has a negligible effect by the time it reaches Portland.
But for coastal communities, the threat is clear, and geologists hope these simulations help coastal residents better prepare and encourage policymakers to come up with better plans, like building more evacuation structures in these areas, buildings strong enough to survive the earthquake and tall enough for people to get above the waves, because 15 minutes, in some cases, won't be enough to get to higher ground.
Unlike wildfires or the flu, there is no earthquake season or tsunami season. These can happen any day, any night. And
in Portland, Keely Chalmers, KGW News.
All right, we dug up something really special from the KGW vault we want to show you. It turns out we actually went inside Woodlawn way back in 1998. We're going to finish the story right after this. Keeping Portland weird tonight? Well, it's actually the wrong Portland. Robbie tweeted at the Portland Press-Herald newspaper saying, "Can you help me understand the Portland riots? Why haven't you stopped the violence?" Well, that's because they're actually the wrong Portland, man. They're in Portland, Maine. But Robbie, we might be able to help you understand what's happening a little bit more on the other side of the country. If you'd like, check out the story on the YouTube channel we have, right on KGW's YouTube channel. You can see it all there. I want to tell you, as soon as we teased that Woodlawn story, hey, we went back inside Woodlawn in 1998. We went to commercial, and my producer got in my ear and said, yeah, we're having a technical problem with that. So we're going to play that for you tomorrow. Sorry to anybody who was looking forward to that. I know a couple of people tweeted me and hit me up on Facebook saying, hey, I'm excited to see that. You're going to have to wait a couple more hours. We're going to have that for you tomorrow. One question coming in saying, hey, Dan, how about a whole news program with nothing but good, positive, uplifting news? Can you do that? I consider it a challenge. We accept that challenge, and we do it every night at 7 o'clock, a show called The Good Stuff. So stick around for a little bit longer after this show. We get the news at 6:30 next, then the good stuff at 7. You can check that out. It's all good news. It'll make you feel great. And Greg saying, hey, Dan, no need to worry about the riots downtown. They will come to an abrupt stop as soon as it starts raining. I hope you're right. I hope it's before that, actually. Appreciate your time tonight. Thanks for being with us. That's the story on this Tuesday. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a good one.